There comes a moment in life when the most powerful move you'll ever make isn't a battle cry, it's a whisper. It's a decision. It's one sentence. And it doesn't come from ego. It comes from alignment. From the part of you that finally remembers, I'm done abandoning myself just to be understood by someone who never saw me. You know that moment when you type the message not to hurt, not to plead, not to provoke, but to honor your own peace. And you hit send. That is the text that took your power back. Not because it changed them, but because it changed you. You see, real power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to be validated. It moves through silence, through stillness, through sovereignty. That one message, maybe 3 lines, maybe one, was a spiritual reset. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about control. It was a return to your center, to your dignity, to your standard, because you finally realize I don't negotiate with inconsistency anymore. I don't shrink myself for crumbs. I don't perform for love. I am not a convenience, a placeholder, or an emotional backup plan. I am the main event of my life. And when you remembered that, something inside you unlocked. That message wasn't petty. It was precise. It wasn't loud. It was legendary, because you didn't just reclaim your time. You reclaimed your identity. You became the author of your worth again. You didn't send it to make them react. You sent it so you could be free. And here's the truth. Most people never understand a freedom doesn't always come through forgiveness. Sometimes it comes through finality. It comes through choosing peace over potential, reality over fantasy, self-respect over self-abandonment. So yes, they may read your message and ignore it. They may try to guilt you. They may even be confused. But you won't be confused anymore, because that one quiet move was louder than every argument you ever had. Louder than every call you never got, louder than every tear you cried wondering if they'd ever get it. You got it. That's all that matters now. You took your power back the moment you decided, I no longer wait to be chosen. I choose myself. I am not in the business of convincing someone to see my value. I embody, I walk in it, I protect it. And the world will rise to meet you when you live like that. You've sent the text, you've shifted the energy, you've closed the chapter. Now walk, not away in anger, but forward in truth. You're not broken. You're not too much. You're not hard to love. You're just finally choosing a life where your power is non-negotiable. And that is the most sacred message you'll ever send. Power isn't loud. It doesn't explode in a fit of rage, and it doesn't beg to be seen. True power is presence, grounded, calm, unwavering. It's the kind of energy that walks into a room and shifts it without needing to say a word. And that's exactly what happens when you send a message not from your wounded self, but from your centered, conscious self. The version of you that no longer needs to shout to be heard because you already know your worth. That text, the one that quietly took your power back, didn't scream. It didn't throw accusations. It didn't try to manipulate or plead. It simply stood tall in truth. Most people think power is about dominance, about being louder, more intense, more forceful. But that's not power. That's panic wearing a mask. That's a nervous system still trying to survive. But real inner power, it's the opposite. It doesn't chase. It doesn't collapse. It holds. It breathes. It chooses. And when you wrote that message, when you chose your words not to attack, but to declare, you weren't reacting, you were reclaiming. You were no longer waiting for their reply to feel validated. You weren't using that text to hook them back in. You weren't seeking attention. You were restoring alignment. Because the most powerful people aren't the ones who make the most noise. They're the ones who can sit with their discomfort and still act with clarity. They're the ones who can be misunderstood and still speak their truth. They're the ones who don't need the last word because they've already won the inner war. When you sent that message, you didn't just press send on a phone. You pressed send on a new chapter of your life. And the energy behind it said everything your words didn't. It said, I no longer abandon myself for temporary connection. I no longer accept inconsistency as affection. I am no longer here to prove I'm worthy of someone who doesn't know how to receive love. And here's the paradox: the quieter the message, the louder the echo. Because when you've been used to reacting from pain, yelling, chasing, proving, explaining, silence becomes a revolution. Stillness becomes a declaration. You become the source of your own validation. And in that moment, you stop bleeding power into people who were never ready to hold it. True power is self-regulation. It's the ability to feel the fire in your chest and still choose a response from love, not fear. It's realizing you can be both soft and strong. You can feel the ache and still not collapse. You can be disappointed and still not dishonor your peace. So many people stay stuck because they think power is something they have to earn from others. But power has never been outside of you. It's the moment you stop performing. The moment you stop asking people to give you what you already possess. It's the shift from needing to be seen to seeing yourself. That's why that one message changed everything. Not because they read it, but because of who you became while writing it. You tapped into a deeper part of yourself, The version of you that doesn't react from wounds but responds from wisdom. You stop letting your emotions hijack your integrity. You stop letting your past dictate your next move. You took your emotions, held them close, and chose alignment anyway. That's not weakness. That's mastery. That's leadership. That's power. Every time you communicate with someone, whether through a message, a look, or your silence, you are teaching them how to treat you. Most people don't realize the power they hold in every interaction. They think they're just responding or expressing how they feel. But in truth, you are setting the rules of engagement every time you allow behavior to go unchecked, every time you chase after half-love, every time you stay silent when your soul is screaming. That's not just communication, that's training. And what you allow is what will continue. The text that took your power back wasn't just a collection of words. It was a classroom. It was a sacred instruction manual for how you now choose to be treated. You weren't explaining, you weren't arguing. You were showing clearly, calmly, and with complete conviction that you are no longer available for anything less than emotional maturity and intentional connection. It didn't matter whether the other person responded or understood. What mattered is that you drew a new line in the sand, and this time it wasn't in pencil. There's something radical that happens when you realize your boundaries don't need to be loud to be respected. They need to be embodied, lived. And a text, when it comes from a place of deep self-worth, can carry the energy of an entire transformation. Because people don't just hear your words, they feel your energy. They feel when you've shifted. They feel when you're no longer desperate to be chosen. They feel when you're not coming from fear, but from fullness, and that shift changes the entire relationship dynamic. Every word we type teaches someone what we tolerate. If you keep explaining your worth to someone who doesn't see it, you're teaching them that your boundaries are negotiable. If you continue to answer messages that come days late with eagerness, you're teaching them that your time isn't sacred. If you apologize for needing clarity, for desiring respect, for wanting consistency, you are training them that your needs are burdens. And over time, this erodes not just the relationship, but your own identity. But when you send a message that is rooted in self-awareness and calm truth, everything changes. You stop asking, will this make them stay? And instead ask, does this honor who I am? You stop molding your communication to keep their comfort intact, and you start choosing words that reflect your highest values: honesty, integrity, and self-respect. That's what real communication is. It's not just expressing your needs, it's expressing your values. And that kind of message isn't transactional. It's transformational. The person on the other end may or may not understand what you're doing. They may try to gaslight, guilt trip, or confuse you. But none of that matters. What matters is that you're no longer speaking from a wounded place. You're speaking from a whole place. And wholeness doesn't beg for understanding. It offers truth, and then it lets go. When you teach people how to treat you, you're not doing it for control. You're doing it for alignment. Because you know that any connection not built on mutual respect is just a performance waiting to collapse. You'd rather be alone in truth than connected in dysfunction. And so that one message, no matter how simple it seemed, became a moment of training, of teaching, of transformation. It told the world, I know who I am, I know what I'm worth, and I will no longer participate in my own disrespect. That's not just sending a text, that's raising your standard. That's building a new emotional blueprint. That's becoming the kind of person who no longer needs to demand better, because you attract better simply by standing in your truth. Stillness is often misunderstood in our world. We live in a culture addicted to noise, to reacting quickly, defending ourselves instantly, filling silence with explanations and arguments. But when you're operating from your highest self, when you're connected to your deepest source of power, you begin to realize something profound. Stillness is not weakness. Stillness is mastery. And when you're dealing with emotional chaos, when someone triggers you, ignores you, pulls away, or disrespects you, the most revolutionary action you can take is not to explode, but to pause. In that pause, you reclaim your freedom. You're no longer at the mercy of their behavior. You are no longer being yanked around by your emotions like a puppet. You're no longer caught in the spiral of overthinking, reacting, regretting, and then explaining. You're anchored, and from that place, you can choose a response that reflects your values, not your wounds. The moment you feel disrespected, dismissed, or devalued, and you don't immediately lash out or collapse, you take back your control. You don't need to chase. You don't need to match their chaos. You don't need to try to make them see your worth. You already know it, and that self-knowing gives you the ability to sit in discomfort without self-abandonment. Stillness doesn't mean you don't feel. You feel everything, the ache, the rejection, the frustration, but you're no longer enslaved by it. You don't have to send 5 messages to be heard. You don't have to defend yourself for needing clarity. You don't have to argue your value. You simply hold your ground. You breathe. You wait. And in that sacred pause, you ask the question, what would the most self-respecting version of me do right now? That's when everything shifts. Because when you stop reacting from the wounded inner child, the one who's afraid of being abandoned, forgotten, or misunderstood, and start responding from the grounded adult who knows their worth, the entire game changes. You're not trying to win anymore. You're not even trying to be understood. You're simply choosing peace over panic, alignment over approval, and truth over urgency. The text you sent wasn't filled with emotional fire. It wasn't laced with desperate attempts to make them care. It was calm, measured, honest. That's what made it so powerful. Because it wasn't written from a place of needing to control the outcome. It was written from a place of clarity, and clarity is the child of stillness. When you're still, you can hear yourself again. You can separate your intuition from your impulse. You can sense what's real from what's reaction. And most importantly, you can act without betraying yourself. The world tells you to respond quickly. Text back fast. Get the last word. Show them you're not weak. But true strength lies in restraint, not the kind that comes from suppressing your truth, but the kind that comes from honoring it in the right time, with the right energy for the right reasons. Because anything said from emotional volatility loses its weight. But when you speak or write from inner stillness, every word becomes sacred. That's why that one message hit so differently. It didn't come from drama. It came from depth. It wasn't about making them feel small. It was about making you feel whole again. You didn't send it to provoke. You sent it because you were finally ready to stop participating in emotional chaos. You were ready to choose presence over pain. You were ready to lead yourself. And the quiet power of that choice, that stillness, echoes longer than any loud reaction ever could. There's a lie so many people believe that closure comes from the other person. That if they would just give us one more conversation, one more explanation, one final confession, we'd finally be able to move on. But that's not closure. That's dependency disguised as desire. Because what you're really looking for isn't their answer. You're looking for clarity. And that clarity doesn't live in their words. It lives in your decision to stop needing theirs. The moment you stopped chasing their validation, something shifted. You weren't looking for them to understand your pain anymore. You weren't writing that message to be chosen. You weren't trying to squeeze a happy ending out of a one-sided story. You were reclaiming your clarity, the kind that comes from deep within, from finally choosing to see reality as it is, not as you wanted it to be. That's when everything starts to align. Because the most powerful clarity comes not from their apology, but from your awareness. You saw the pattern, the inconsistency, the breadcrumbing, the avoidance. You felt the emotional starvation that happens when someone doesn't meet you where you are. And instead of justifying it again, you finally acknowledged it. You didn't need to scream. You didn't need to beg. You didn't even need them to explain. You sent the message not to reconnect, but to release. Clarity is a spiritual gift. It shows up when you get radically honest with yourself about what you've accepted, about who you've become, trying to keep the connection, and about what it's cost you. You start to see that the pain wasn't just about what they did, it was about what you allowed. And when you face that truth, without judgment, but with compassion, something unlocks inside you. You realize you don't need one more reason to walk away. You already have the only one that matters. It doesn't feel like love anymore. That's what that text was. It wasn't you reaching out for validation. It was you stepping into the clarity of your own boundaries. You didn't send it because you wanted them to fix it. You sent it because you were ready to stop abandoning yourself. And when you choose yourself like that, not from ego, but from soul, that's when real healing begins. The person who hurt you can't give you closure because they're not the one holding it. You are. It was never about them giving you peace. It was always about you remembering your power. That message wasn't about ending something. It was about beginning again with yourself. It was the line in the sand. It was the internal shift from, I hope they come around, to, I deserve more, even if it's not with them. It's hard because your mind will scream for answers. Your heart will ache for connection. Your body might tremble at the thought of truly letting go. But you don't negotiate with the old story anymore. You tell the truth. And the truth is, you deserve to be met, seen, and chosen, not eventually, not conditionally, but consistently. And when someone can't or won't offer that, clarity tells you it's time to stop twisting yourself into someone you're not, just to keep a relationship that never truly honored you. You're not bitter. You're not cold. You're just no longer available for emotional confusion. You've outgrown the version of you that needed their permission to let go. And so you sent the message. You spoke your truth. You chose clarity over comfort. That's not weakness. That's liberation. That's the moment you remembered that your peace is sacred, your voice is powerful, and your self-worth doesn't require their understanding to be valid. Boundaries are not walls. They are invitations to love you with clarity. When you set a boundary, especially in the form of a clear, calm, and intentional message. You are not pushing people away. You're simply defining the terms under which you are willing to connect. That message you sent, the one that seemed simple on the surface, was far more than a text. It was the articulation of your self-respect. It was a declaration that said, this is where I end, and this is where you begin. No blame, no shame, just truth. For too long, you may have believed that keeping the peace meant staying silent, that in order to be loved, you had to be flexible with your standards, that if you were too difficult, too demanding, or too sensitive, you'd be abandoned. But the reality is, the more you compromise your boundaries, the more disconnected you become from yourself. And the more disconnected you are from yourself, the more painful every relationship becomes, not because of what they do to you, but because of what you're doing to yourself by staying silent. When you finally send the message that sets the boundary, you're not just communicating with the other person. You're communicating with your future. You're letting the universe, your nervous system, your inner child, all of it, know I no longer betray myself to be loved. That one message, written without emotional venom, but full of spiritual conviction, changes your frequency. It sends a signal that you're ready for a higher standard, not just from others, but from yourself. It's not about punishing them. It's not about controlling the outcome. It's about defining the container in which real love can grow. Because love without boundaries is not love. It's chaos. And you're done with chaos. You're done with inconsistent texting patterns, half-hearted communication, hot and cold behavior. You're done with relationships that feel more like riddles than sanctuaries. That message was your way of saying, I'm no longer playing small in the name of connection. When you set a boundary, people will reveal themselves. The ones who were using your flexibility as a license to mistreat you will push back. They'll call you too much. They'll say you've changed. They'll try to guilt you. But pay attention. That reaction is the very proof that the boundary was needed. People who are healthy will respect the line. They may not love it, but they'll understand it. Because they understand that boundaries are the evidence of self-worth, not emotional distance. That message was power in motion. It was not dramatic. It was not impulsive. It was mature. It was grounded. It was direct. And in a world where most people are conditioned to avoid hard conversations, your willingness to speak your truth is a revolutionary act of love, not just for yourself, but for the space you're co-creating with others. You are modeling a new standard of emotional communication, one that doesn't rely on guilt, fear, or silence. You didn't need to yell. You didn't need to beg. You simply defined your line. And the beauty of that moment is that it allowed you to breathe again, because boundaries don't just protect you from others. They protect your energy, your clarity, your emotional safety. They let you show up fully without the fear of losing yourself in the process. And perhaps most importantly, that message was the moment you chose integrity over attachment. You stopped needing to hold on to someone just because of history or hope. You chose what honors your heart now. And that choice, made through one simple, intentional message, was an act of radical self-love. Letting go is one of the most misunderstood acts of power in the human experience. People often think that to be strong, you must fight harder, hold on longer, prove your worth, and convince others of your value. But real power, it doesn't demand, it doesn't plead, it doesn't grasp with white knuckles, hoping someone finally wakes up and chooses you. Real power is quiet, it's rooted, it's the ability to walk away without bitterness because you've remembered who you are. That's what happened when you sent that message. The one that didn't try to win, didn't try to fix, didn't try to force understanding. That was the moment you let go. Not with rage, not with resentment, but with reverence. Reverence for the person you're becoming. Reverence for the years you spent over functioning, over explaining, and over giving. Reverence for the truth that love, when it's real, never needs to be chased. And finally, reverence for the realization that healing doesn't always look like reconciliation. Sometimes it looks like release. You sent the message not because you wanted to hurt them, but because you were done hurting yourself. You weren't slamming a door. You were simply closing it gently but firmly, knowing that peace doesn't come from clinging. It comes from clarity. That's a level of emotional intelligence most people spend their whole lives avoiding. It's not easy. It requires surrender. It requires grief. It requires sitting with all the hope you once had and choosing moment by moment to put it down, not because it wasn't beautiful, but because it's no longer aligned with your truth. Letting go without needing to win is not weakness. It's divine maturity. It means you're no longer making your worth dependent on someone else's ability to love you properly. You're no longer measuring your value by how someone else shows up or doesn't. That message you sent wasn't a cry for attention. It was a calm, grounded exhale of self-respect. It said, I don't need closure from you. I've found it within myself, and that's rare. Because most people wait. They wait for the other person to understand. They wait for the apology. They wait for the moment it all makes sense. But sometimes closure never comes wrapped in words. Sometimes closure is the moment you stop needing it altogether. The moment you choose to stop explaining your soul to someone who refuses to listen. The moment you realize that your healing isn't tied to their awakening. When you let go, you create space for peace, space for growth, space for the kind of connection that doesn't make you question your worth every other day. And the paradox is that in letting go, you don't lose power. You gain it. You become magnetic. You become whole because your energy is no longer scattered trying to fix something that was never yours to fix. That message, it wasn't loud, but it spoke volumes. It said, I love myself too much to stay in confusion. I respect myself too much to continue explaining basic decency. I trust myself enough to believe that what's meant for me will meet me with clarity, not chaos. That's not detachment. That's devotion to your own soul. And maybe they didn't respond. Maybe they disappeared. Maybe they tried to guilt you, but none of that matters anymore because you didn't send that message to get a reaction. You sent it to declare your evolution. You sent it to mark the moment you stopped needing to be chosen and started choosing yourself. That's the day your life changed. The day you stopped performing for love and started embodying it. The day you stopped chasing and started attracting. The day you let go, not in anger, but in honor. And in that sacred release, you quietly, but completely took your power back. So now you know the power was never in their reply, their validation, or their ability to finally understand you. The power was in you all along, in your ability to speak with clarity, to hold your ground with grace, and to walk away with love still in your heart. That one quiet message didn't just close a chapter. It opened a new one where you no longer chase peace. You become it. Thank you for listening, for choosing yourself, and for having the courage to rise above chaos with calm, to choose truth over comfort, and to reclaim your power not with noise, but with sacred stillness.